Hello my students, and welcome back to SP 3673, Assessment of Students with Autism and Other Developmental Disabilities. In this unit, we are going to cover an advanced methods for functional analysis of challenging behavior. And if you haven't taken 3633, and so functional analysis of challenging behavior is going to be new to you, please feel free to email me or another instructor, if another instructor happens to be teaching this course, and ask them for the links to the pre-recorded video lectures that covered functional analysis in SP 3633. We'll be happy to provide you with that, and it may be worth your time to review the content from that lecture before proceeding with this one. Okay, that said, let's proceed. So here's the outline for this unit. First, we're going to review FBA and functional analysis of challenging behavior. And then we're going to get to an advanced multi-element functional analysis discussion. In the prior unit on an advanced analysis of single subject design, we didn't get into an advanced analysis of multi-element designs because we're going to do that here in the context of functional analysis. We're going to revisit and review the classic Iwata FA briefly. That's the first functional analysis that used multi-element design to test for multiple functions of challenging behavior. Specifically, they evaluated the functions of self-injurious behavior. And then we're going to review adaptations in FA technology that researchers have developed over time to make them compatible with a variety of environments and for a variety of populations. And then a checklist you can use to assess your readiness to conduct a functional analysis. From there, we'll look at each of the new adaptations of FA technology. So in other words, a variety of designs that can be used to conduct functional analysis. And they vary in complexity, and they vary in terms of their advantages and their disadvantages, and the amount of expertise required to conduct them, and also the types of settings where they're more or less feasible or appropriate. So there's the single function FA, the brief FA, extended alone series, reversal, pairwise tests, latency-based FA, trial-based FA, and precursor FA. We'll also, when we talk about adaptations of FA technology and a checklist, we'll also discuss some myths or misconceptions about functional analysis, or some barriers that may arise to using functional analysis, and I'll provide you with some potential solutions. So the main ideas in this unit are that functional analysis is the gold standard of assessment for the treatment of challenging behavior in individuals with disabilities. And I should even further clarify, it's the gold standard of assessment for developing treatments for challenging behavior in individual disability. And indeed, the ethical and humane treatment of challenging behavior may require a functional analysis. Sometimes it doesn't. In some cases it may. In most cases, for children and some adults with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, in most cases it's the best way to go, because we'll talk about the advantages of FAs, but essentially they make it more likely the practitioner will deliver an effective intervention and avoid harmful or ineffective interventions for the learner, or the client, or the patient, or the student. Conducting a functional analysis does require prerequisite skills, including mastery of ABA principles. So a functional analysis is not something you should attempt until you have probably a couple years of experience using ABA-based interventions and assessments. And in most cases, you'll need someone with expertise in functional analysis to directly train you how to do it. Now I say most cases, because some of you at some point in your career will have the skills to take an advanced course or to read the scientific literature and implement a functional analysis in a clinical or educational setting just based on what you've read and based on your experience without having someone directly train you. In fact, that's how I did it. And when we talk about the evidence-based practice of ABA earlier in this course, that framework describes how it is that I was able to train myself to use functional analysis. Given sufficient skills, educators can and should conduct functional analysis in classrooms and other school settings, so you can ensure students receive the best and most effective and most efficient and simplest interventions for their challenging behavior, and help them avoid ineffective or harmful interventions. Different functional analysis designs are more or less useful in different situations. And so we'll talk about how to match in the type of functional analysis to the context, to the learner, and to your level of expertise. So let's begin with a review of functional behavior assessment and functional analysis of challenging behavior. You've seen this figure before. I use the same figure so that it can help you remember some of what you've already learned about it, and then we're going to apply that to this unit, the concepts in this unit. So there are many things to consider when you conduct a functional behavior assessment. One is the purpose. The purpose of the functional behavior assessment is to identify the function of challenging behavior. Specifically, that means to identify the consequences in the environment that are currently maintaining or reinforcing the behavior. That is the cause of the behavior. You identify the cause, you can develop an appropriate and effective intervention that will replace challenging topographies of that behavior with socially appropriate alternative topographies of the behavior that can produce the same reinforcer that in the past was produced by the challenging topographies of behavior. And so there are legal considerations. You have to have mastery of the fundamental principles of behavior to do this successfully. Don't let anyone trick you into thinking that you can just jump in and conduct an FBA without mastery of fundamental principles of behavior like reinforcement and punishment and SDs and MOs and response generalization and stimulus generalization and so forth. We can matching law. We could go on. Stimulus equivalence. We could keep going. The verbal operants. And so functional behavior assessment is conducted based on the philosophy of radical behaviorism. So if you haven't mastered the fundamental aspects or the critical features of radical behaviorism, you're not ready to conduct an effective functional behavior assessment. Functional behavior assessment is ABA technology, and that means someone who implements a functional behavior assessment should be conducting that assessment in line with the ethics code specified by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. And the functional behavior assessment should be conducted in the context of evidence-based practice in applied behavior analysis, considering client values in context, social validity, and by relying on the most relevant scientific literature. Now, functional behavior assessment consists of indirect assessment and direct assessment. During indirect assessment, you use the following methods: interview, questionnaire, rating scales, record review, in order to identify and characterize the challenging behavior in the context where it occurs, to start to get information about what happens before the behavior occurs, what happens after the behavior occurs, when the behavior tends to occur, with who. So notice that this is very much the beginning of starting to identify antecedents and consequences that control the behavior. But indirect assessment is never enough. Indirect assessment is too broad in scope and too low in fidelity in the majority of cases to arrive at the causes of the behavior. So you have to proceed with direct assessment. In indirect assessment, you're not observing the learner engage in the behavior. In direct assessment, you move to now observing the learner engage in the challenging behavior in the context where it occurs. Okay? And direct assessment consists of descriptive assessment, structured assessment, and functional analysis. And each of these types of direct assessment use different methods. Descriptive assessment uses narrative data collection, ABC data collection, and scatter plot. Now, with narrative data collection, you schedule times to observe the learner in contexts where people indicated in the indirect assessment that the behavior occurs. Okay, so you go and you observe and you take notes on a continuous stream of behavior and events that are occurring during your observation period, which could be 5 minutes, it could be 20 minutes, it could be an hour, and you would repeat that. And largely what that helps you to do is start to focus on some of the relevant antecedents and consequences, but also operationally define the behavior. That's define the behavior in observable, measurable terms in a way that is precise and complete and defines the boundaries, what is and what isn't an example of the behavior. From there, you collect ABC data. That's where we're recording specific antecedents and consequences pertaining to each instance or episode of the behavior you observed during your observation periods. And when you do ABC data collection, what you're doing is you're starting to develop hypotheses about the potential functions of the behavior, whether the behavior is controlled by socially mediated reinforcement in the form of attention, tangibles, escape, avoidance, or whether the challenging behavior may be reinforced automatically, that is, independent of other people. The behavior may produce consequences in the environment that reinforce it. And then there's the scatter plot. The scatter plot is used to help you identify times of days and activities when the behavior is or isn't likely, and that helps you to narrow the time of day and the settings where you conduct your narrative assessment and you collect ABC data. Now, once you've observed the behavior in descriptive assessment, you proceed with structured assessment. In descriptive assessment, you only observe and you never interact with the client or the learner or the student. In structured assessment, you may interact with them and you may ask other people to interact with them, but in a very specific way. You don't tell people how to react to the learner's behavior, but you do ask them to manipulate antecedents in a trigger analysis to see whether certain antecedents evoke or abate the behavior if they've seemed to function as SDs or MOs, or perhaps respondent stimuli. And so what examples of this are, providing the learner with some preferred items or activities and then taking a turn and withholding the item for a while. Or to give the learner attention and then withhold attention. Or to place easy, medium, or difficult chores or academic demands or instructions to the individual. Ask them to transition from one place to another, interrupt an ongoing activity they're engaged with. There's a variety of things that you can do. I'm just listing a few, but we could go on and on about manipulating antecedents to see what happens. You collect data and you can further refine your hypotheses about the function of the behavior. And then you proceed with functional analysis. Functional analysis, you can see, is at the tail end of the functional behavior assessment. And this is when you're not just observing and you're not just manipulating antecedents, but you're also manipulating consequences. But this is very systematic, it's highly structured, and now when you conduct a functional analysis, the methods that you're using are rigorous enough that you can say you're using an experimental evaluation of functional relations between the behavior and the environment to identify the cause of the behavior, the function of the behavior. And in each regardless of the type of functional analysis, you're comparing levels of the challenging behavior between test and control conditions. Where the control condition doesn't have the variables you think controls the behavior, and then the test conditions each have the variables that you think may control the behavior. You determine what the function of the behavior is from those data by comparing levels of behavior in the test and control condition. So if the condition where that contains the variable you thought might cause the behavior is associated with the highest amounts of challenging behavior relative to a condition where those same variables are not present, well, then you can conclude that you've identified the function of the behavior. We'll talk more about this going forward. But this is just another review of functional behavior assessment. And the reason why functional behavior assessment is conducted is that it allows the practitioner to help an individual with challenging behavior most effectively by placing less emphasis on the form or structure or topography of the behavior and almost exclusively focusing on the function or the cause of the behavior. Okay? Which can get tricky because a certain topography or form of or structure of a behavior can have one or multiple functions. If you intervene on a behavior based on the wrong function, your intervention is going to be ineffective, and you may worsen the behavior for that individual and everyone around them. Main point is to use a functional behavior assessment to make sure your intervention corresponds to the function or the cause of the behavior. And this is an overall process that describes functional behavior assessment. It's the behavioral assessment quasi-funnel. And the main point of this assessment is that different stages of assessment have are associated with different degree of scope and a different degree of fidelity. Okay, and so what you do is you begin in this screening stage, where outside of a school setting, if we're talking about a private ABA provider, they would receive a phone call from a caregiver of the child reporting challenging behavior, and the screening process would basically be a conversation over the phone with that caregiver to determine if you're, we're not going to go into depth in this because this is just an overview, but basically it's a determination if there seems to actually be a problem with the behavior and if you're a relevant service provider. But screening doesn't really take place in a school setting. The IEP team has determined that a functional behavior assessment is required, and so you proceed. So things are a little bit different in school setting. But anyways, so when you're doing at the screening process, or you're conducting indirect assessments, so that's the rating scales, questionnaires, interviews, record review, it's broad in scope, meaning you're considering a wide range of variables, and it's low in fidelity, meaning it doesn't really get you very close to what the cause of the behavior are. Then you proceed to descriptive assessment, with now you're observing the behavior in the context where it occurs, and so you're considering fewer variables, so it's the scope of assessment is in between broadband and narrowband, and the fidelity is mid-fidelity. And then you proceed ultimately with functional analysis. Now, functional analysis considers the fewest variables, so it's narrowband in scope, and the information about the variables that control the behavior is most accurate here with functional analysis, so that's what's meant by high fidelity. And then you will proceed with baseline assessment, progress monitoring, and follow-up assessment. As you can see that the range of variables that you assess starts to widen a little bit, and the fidelity assessment starts to decrease a little bit. Okay, so the main point of this is functional analysis has the functional analysis stage of the behavioral assessment quasi-funnel has the highest fidelity, and considers the fewest variables. It's the most parsimonious approach to determining the causes or identifying the causes of the behavior. Okay, so let's end video part 1 here, and we'll start getting more into detail about functional analysis in the next video part. See you then.